Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for coming in and doing this. It couldn't be more timely, although this is a major issue all across the board. My questions are largely geared on something you've all talked about and what the purpose of this hearing is, and that is the ability to leverage economic power, whether that is direct spending and investments that they make, that China's Communist Party makes abroad, or access to their marketplace, to get all kinds of actors to bend to their will, international organizations, countries and governments, and corporations. It is my belief, and I think well-founded, that there are major American corporations who are either witting or unwittingly lobbyists on behalf of the official narratives and policy preferences of the Communist Party of China. And the reason is pretty simple, and that is they go to them and say, if you want to continue to have access to our, whether they say it or they imply it, if you want to continue to have access to our marketplace, if you want to continue to be able to sell things here, which represents X amount of your annual revenue, then we expect you to go talk to your quote-unquote friends in America and get them to back off. And I think that perhaps the most stunning example of it has been the cowardly but real effort behind the scenes by several corporations who benefit from slave labor to impede the passage of the Uyghur forced labor bill that the chairman and I and so many others, including in the House, have been working on. So with that reality in place, we've got some things that we need to tackle. First, Ms. Glazer, I think in your testimony you recommended developing of a voluntary code of conduct for businesses regarding China, I think including a commitment to refrain from self-censorship. That's another pretty amazing thing, and that is how much of the information and news we today consume is self-censored because they don't want to not be able to distribute that program, that movie, whatever it might be, in a pretty large market. But how would we hold these companies accountable if they in fact signed this code of conduct? Obviously, this can't be a sort of a legal prescription. It sounds almost like a shaming and naming effort, but how would we first, get companies to sign on, but more importantly, how would they be held? Who would hold them accountable to violations of it, and how would we hold them accountable if we had such a code?
Well, thank you, Senator Rubio. It's very difficult, I think, to influence companies' choices as well as to hold them accountable. If companies don't sign up to a code of conduct, yes, we can name and shame and say they are not interested in adhering to our values and joining with other companies around the United States and the world to defend those democratic values. So yes, it is a mechanism essentially to name and shame and try to provide incentives for companies to get on board. In the case of something like slave labor, then I think you have more options. Because if you do good research and you identify that companies are using slave labor, you make that data public, then that company is going to be spotlighted in a way that it doesn't want to be. And perhaps people will buy fewer of their goods. People will write articles about them. This is going to be very negative in terms of, I think, their bottom line as well as their reputation. In terms of things like movies, obviously far more difficult because the Chinese have accumulated a great deal of influence because there's a lot of people who go watch movies in China. So I think that in that regard, you have to start with naming and shaming, and I think making something like this voluntary, you're more likely to get companies to join on board. At least it's a beginning step. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Wang, you talked about passage of Senate Bill 413 that establishes the China Censorship Monitor and Action Group, and I'm proud to be the lead Republican co-sponsor on this bill. I hope we can pass it swiftly. You recommend increasing transparency among American companies that are significantly exposed to China. Do you think it'd be a good idea to require U.S.-listed companies to disclose the existence of Chinese Communist Party committees and the role they play in the company's corporate governance in their annual reports to the SEC?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I do believe that American businesses should be disclosing these. I was reading a bit more about Hollywood, actually. I read a recent report by PEN America, and it stated that a lot of the filmmakers have private meetings with decision makers. So I think when we ask for transparency, We can ask about their market shares, their closed-door meetings, and who are they talking with? How can we better understand the situation when we don't have this data and we don't have this information? So yes, I do believe that we should be
Just to be clear, when you talk about these private meetings, what you're basically saying is they're going through a pre-censorship review, like this is what our movie's about, this is what our script is about. Does any of this give you a problem or heartburn? They're trying to avoid producing something they later on have to edit so they can have it distribute in this market.
correct. According to the report, there is a quote that Xi Jinping says often. He would like films to, quote, tell China's story well, end quote.
Professor Hung, do you believe Hong Kong should continue to enjoy its reputation as a center for international finance, given the power the Communist Party of China now exercises over foreign companies, the last year's detainment of and arrest of business executives? Should they continue to be considered the sort of international hub that's safe to do business in?
Thank you, Senator Rubio. Then I think, as I outlined in my testimony, there's a lot of troubling sign that the nature of the Hong Kong Financial Center on the institution that protect its integrity and fairness has been deteriorating. There's some remaining institutions and practices that separate Hong Kong financial market from, for example, Shanghai or Shenzhen financial market, but the direction of the development is really troubling. And I think what we and U.S. can do is to indicate the kind of measures that U.S. can do. For example, as I recommended, that it can be put on the table that at some point that U.S. can ban the investing in the Chinese government bonds, and just like what we have done with regard to the Russian sovereign debt, and also totally decertify Hong Kong and stop recognizing Hong Kong as a kind of a financial market separate from the mainland China, and with regard to the access to U.S. dollar and many other measures. So this kind of option need to be put on the table, and to let them know that if they go further, then this will be enacted. Thank you.
My time has expired, but I thank you all for being here. I apologize I didn't get to you, Mr. Cooper, but I thank you all for being a part of this.